My name is Jacob Lestenkof. I was born in 1932, 3 June 1932, on St. George Island in the Pribilofs.
The last time we talked was November 2014, and we talked about some of your memories about the World War II time period. And I was hoping maybe if you had other stories about that time period, we could talk about that. And then also your experiences in Korea and your veteran experiences and how you became a general. So we can kind of start where you want to start.
Okay. Let me start with the World War II period, because I was the youngest then. When the war came in December 7th, 1941, I was a child living on St. George Island in the Pribilofs. We were evacuated from the islands in early June of 1942. Both the residents of St. Paul and St. George and the Aleutians, a number of the villages in the Aleutians were removed from their villages and relocated in southeastern Alaska. From the Pribilofs, were moved to a place in southeastern Alaska at Funter Bay, and that's where we resided from 1942 till 1944 at Funter Bay. Both St. George, people from St. George and St. Paul. The reason for that evacuation and relocation was a military-connected fear that the invading Japanese, who had already captured the village and people of that too, and also the island of Kiska in the Aleutians, and that there was a fear that the Japanese would be moving further east along the Aleutians and to include the Pribilof Islands.
When you were at Funter Bay, what was it like being at Funter Bay, and what was it like having people from the Pribilof Islands together there, from St. George and St. Paul? Had you been to St. Paul before?
No, I had not been to St. Paul, but many of the people from St. Paul and from St. George knew each other, either through family relations and maybe marriages that have occurred over the years. So there was a social connection between the islands. But you raise an interesting point. So this is the first time where the two villages, although they were 40 miles apart, out in the Bering Sea, but now co-located in one bay, in Funter Bay and whatnot, they had a chance more to know each other better. The interrelationships were closer and so forth. So that was probably socially, that was kind of an interesting experience for them.
So you were school age when you were evacuated and when you were at Funter Bay?
I was 10 years old then.
10 years old.
And I'm trying to remember that during the summer, we arrived at Funter Bay in June of 1942, while the teachers and the federal agents that were in charge of the Aleuts coming from the Pribilof Islands were amongst the Aleuts that were evacuated also and arrived at Funter Bay. Some of them left, and I seem to recall the teachers for St. George found the conditions too horrible.
Wow.
At Funter Bay and departed. So there was really no school occurring. That's my memory now. No school occurring at Funter Bay. That is when my grandfather and my mother decided that they should try to relocate to Juneau. Many of the Aleuts that came from the Pribilofs from Funter Bay, in order to find work, traveled to Juneau because there were labor shortages going on there, because of the war. So we moved to Juneau, and then I went to school there at the public school in Juneau, Alaska. My mother and other ladies that came to Juneau from Funter ended up working as maids at the hotel, and my mother did that at the Baranoff Hotel. Her health during that period was not good, and so she passed away in 1943 when I was still 10 years old. So she's buried there in Juneau.
I'm sorry to hear that. Did your grandpa work in Juneau? Did he have a job?
My grandfather was with us at Juneau. So during the winter of 1942-43, she passed away in March of 1943. During the winter, I went to... Pardon?
From illness?
From pneumonia, and her health was never that great, not that good. During the summer of 1943, my grandfather decided to move back to Funter Bay to join the rest of the people from the Pribilofs there. So we spent the winter of 43-44 at Funter Bay. I cannot remember going to school at Funter Bay.
Yeah. What would the kids do then? Would they help with chores?
I don't recall. I don't recall exactly. There certainly was no homeschooling, but I don't recall a organized teaching program that was going on at Funter Bay during those years. My memory of those times were not pleasant. I've tend to kind of eliminate them and not to remember too much. So my memories of exactly what was going on at Funter Bay at that time. The living conditions were not very, very good. The food was short, the quarters were cold, and not pleasant. So in then the summer of 1944, the government decided that the military campaign in the Aleutians was winding down. The American forces have recaptured the island of Aleut and Kiska, so that it was fairly safe now maybe to return, not everyone, not the people from the Aleutians because there were still heavy military activity there, but to return the people to the Pribilofs because they were very interested in having the first SEAL operation continue because that brought revenues, to the government, both for St. Paul and St. George. So the Aleuts from the Pribilofs then were returned earlier, 1 year earlier, than the people from the Aleutians.
So you returned in the summer of 44 back to St. George.
Correct.
With your grandpa.
Yep.
Was your grandpa, did he ever work on the sealing operations, or was that in his younger days?
It was during his younger days. He was then, in his 70s.
Wow. Yeah.
So he had partially retired. Before the evacuation, before leaving the islands in 1942, he took care of the cattle. We had cows there and pigs and chickens and so forth. And he took care of those livestock, which were used really to support the non-native government workers there.
So did you finish school at St. George, or did you go to boarding school for high school?
I finished, we were there from 1944 in 45, 40. In 1946, I graduated from the 8th grade.
Wow, yeah.
I must have been, I could have been, 43, 10, 11, 12. I think I was 13 when I finished the 8th grade. There were, I think, 2 of us or 3 of us in the class. So typically what happened with the young people in the Pribilofs, and especially the boys, that when you finished school, typically about age 14, you went to work. You went to work for the government.
Wow.
So when I finished school in 1946, at the 8th grade, I decided to work hard to get off the island to travel to high school. Others stayed and went to work for the government, usually at the age 14. So at that time, I and a few others from St. George and St. Paul applied to the Indian Affairs boarding school at Wrangell Institute. So we went down to Wrangell Institute, and I became a freshman there in the fall of 1946 and went to school there. That was the last year, by the way, 1946 and 47 of Wrangell Institute, because during that year, that winter, the boarding schools that the Indian Affairs ran at White Mountain, at Eklutna, and at Wrangell were to be closed at the end of the school year, 1947, because the Bureau of Indian Affairs had acquired Mount Edgecombe, which was a naval base on Japonski Island, right across from Sitka. The reason for that is that they acquired all the facilities, the dining rooms, the barracks, and so forth, and and the hangars became a national campus to accommodate Native students from the previously closed boarding schools at White Mountain, at Wrangell, and at Eklutna. So I traveled during that winter, by the way, my grandfather passed away. So I really had no family connections anymore to St. George. So I did not, some of the young people who were at Wrangell from the Pribilofs went back to the islands for the summer.
In 47 or 48?
In 47.
Okay, 47.
And instead I went over to the new school at Mount Edgecombe at Sitka.
So then you finished school at Edgecombe.
I finished school there, but I took 1 year off of the high school during the year, I think, 48, 49, and went and studied to become a merchant marine mariner. So the school had a training ship. It was a surplus World War II Army FS boat, and I served on that. Took a year off of school to serve on there to become a deck officer.
What started your interest in being a deck officer?
I don't know. It was probably related to the fact that the islands are very maritime oriented, and ships became an important part, I think, of our lives, because that's how our connection to the outside world and growing up in the Pribilofs was through ships. So I think that's where the interest came about. And so I did that, and after that year, that must have been the summer of 48 when I finished that training, and I finished my high school training and graduated in 1951.
When did you're a Korean War veteran, and when did you enlist, or when did you become drafted for Korea?
After I graduated from high school, I got a job on a ship. As a matter of fact, on that training ship that I was on, I was hired as a crew member on the deck, and one of the requirements that you have in order to become a deck officer is that you have to have time on the ship. They call it a sea time. So that was my interest, to do that and to continue my schooling in the Seattle area towards getting a Coast Guard license to first mate or third mate or whatever. But then the Korean War was going on. The draft was very, very heavy, and I felt it was getting very, very close that I was going to get drafted, so I decided to enlist in the Marines. And So I enlisted in the Marines as an enlisted man.
What year?
That was in 1951.
Okay.
November of 1951. And I went to boot camp in San Diego.
Wow, pretty.
Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Went to boot camp in San Diego. Then when I graduated from boot camp, went up to infantry training at Camp Pendleton. As you probably know, during that period, the Marines were very, very active in Korea. We had the 1st Division there after the Incheon landing, the 1st Division fighting over there. So the drafts of Marines being trained and going over to Korea was quite heavy. They had requested a volunteers for people to join a new reconnaissance company at Camp Pendleton for the 3rd Division that was forming up at Camp Pendleton. So I volunteered for that and got accepted, and the recon companies were the successor to the World War II Raider battalions, and stayed with them. It was a volunteer outfit, and they had a rule. We operated on the beach quite a bit with the underwater demolition teams from the Navy. There was a rule that if you wanted to leave because something happened, you could do it at any time. And so one evening, coming in on rubber boats off the coast of California, I near drowned because our boat broached in the surf, and we had a lot of equipment in there, and barely made it to the beach.
Oh
So I decided, no, this was the time to leave. So I did that, and very shortly thereafter that I got shipped to Korea.
Wow.
Anyway, so when I went to Korea, I became an infantryman in a rifle company.
In the, what year in the 50s?
That would be in early 53.
Okay.
So I served in Korea in a rifle company until the end of the war, which was in 1953. In July of 1953, when not the war ended, it was just a ceasefire, which, by the way, still exists today. Then, when the war was over, I remained in Korea. I became one of the leaders for an observation post that overlooked Panmunjom, where all of the prisoners that we had, the Chinese and North Korean prisoners, and American prisoners, by the way, coming back in from North Korea, were repatriated. I was in charge of an outpost that overlooked that Panmunjom. Yeah, I did not leave Korea until I think it was April or May of 1954. Came back to the U.S. and then was released from the Marine Corps in November of 1954. That was my Korean experience. During the final months of the war, by the way, over there from probably from March till the end of the war, was quite intense during the final negotiations that were going on to try to create a ceasefire, which occurred on the 27th of July, 1953. So we had a lot of casualties on the line during that period of time.
What was it like knowing that it was an intense time and being overseas in Korea? What do you remember? Any feelings you had?
You know, there's something about when you're in combat, not everyone is comfortable with that. Well, being in combat is not a comfortable event, but I seem to have been at least not nervous about it. And there are many people who are just not comfortable, in that setting and so forth. So my service over there I thought was okay.
Yeah.
You know, I felt okay about it. Matter of fact, I really liked the military.
And you continued.
So when I got discharged, I was still in the reserve, and I wanted to maintain my affiliation, you know. And when I returned back to Alaska, I could not find, I returned to Sitka and I could not find a Marine unit. So I eventually joined the National Guard.
Okay, what year was this?
I joined the Guard in 1956.
1956. And when were your discharge papers from the Marine?
1954.
Okay, yeah. So what was it like being in the National Guard and eventually you received your promotions?
Well, I really liked it because by the time I returned back to Sitka, because of the fact that I had my maritime training on the ship, I was able to get a Coast Guard license to run ferry boats that ran between Mount Edgecombe and Sitka before the bridge was built. So we carried 55 passengers and so forth. So I did that. I got my license and ran the ferry boats there. Joined the Guard when I was during that period deal. The Army at that time, I was a Marine, but I converted to the Army by joining the Guard, and they had a program that if you were a non-commissioned officer in combat, that you were able to, through some studies, get a commission, and that's how I got a commission. Then I went down to Fort Benning, Georgia, and took the basic trainings and all of the trainings, and got my commission as a second lieutenant in 1957, I think it was.
Wow.
And then continued to work at Sitka, got married, had children during that period of time. Then in 1959, I was asked to go on active duty with the Army and with the Guard. And in doing that, I relocated to Anchorage.
And then your work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs came after your military service.
After my military service. I served in the Guard on full-time, on active duty, until 1974.
Okay, wow, that's a lot of years.
Yeah. So during that time, by the time I left the military on active duty, I was still in the reserve by that time. But when I left in '74, I was a full colonel. Had gone to all of the Army schools, and I also attended the Army War College. And so
where was that?
Where?
Yeah.
That was at Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania, the old Indian school.
Interesting, yeah. I recognize that name.
You recognize the name?
Yeah.
So when I left the Guard in '74, then I like I say, I was still in the reserve, and I was hired at AFN to create a manpower office that was designed to hire Alaska Natives to work on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline.
Wow.
I did that. And a year later became the executive vice president for AFN.
Wow.
And charged with coordinating the details incident to the Land Claims Act.
So this was 75.
This was in '75, okay. Yeah. I did that until 1976. And in 1976, I left AFN to establish some own private businesses here in town, in Anchorage. And then in '77, I was hired by the Cook Inlet Native Association to establish a manpower program, and a year later I became the executive director of CINA, Cook Inlet Native Association,
wow.
which was one of the larger native nonprofit organizations in Alaska. Today it's called CITC, Cook Inlet
Right.
Tribal Council. And during that period also got elected to the board of directors for CIRI, Cook Inlet Regional Corporation. Did that. Then in 1981, I was hired back into the government to become the area director for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in
Wow.
1981. And I did that until 1988.
Wow.
And during that period, I rejoined the Guard in 1986 because I was still in the reserve as a brigadier general, and became the assistant adjutant general for Army for the Guard.
Wow.
And when I left the Bureau of Indian Affairs, retired from federal service as a senior executive service in 1988, I was hired as the deputy commissioner for the Community and Regional Affairs. And I did that until 1990 and retired from the state in 1990.
Wow. 1990. With your work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I'm curious because it was basically one of the government programs. I know that with the Pribilof Islands from World War II, it seemed like the Fish and Wildlife Service had a lot of control over the Pribilof Islands. I mean, and even in the post-war years and before. But I guess the BIA was separate. But I'm wondering how you felt about working for the government given the history of the Pribilof Islands.
Well, you know, being in the military, of course, I was in government. You know, I got government services there. And I guess I really never harbored any, negative feelings about it. I think that maybe, what maybe happened with the, it was during the times, I guess. It was almost like running a plantation.
Yeah.
You know, where the natives certainly were the labor force that the government ran.
And those were two different entities. Fish and Wildlife Service was different than the BIA.
The Bureau of Indian Affairs handled a lot of the native affairs in the Aleutians, like they did with Interior Alaska. But the Pribilof Islands were a separate thing because of the seals,
right?
The seal islands and fur islands, and were handled under the Interior Department's different, under Bureau of Fisheries at that time, and the sealing division, I guess, within the department. Yeah, it was really different than the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Yeah.
And I, historically, I don't really know when the Bureau of Indian Affairs became connected to the Pribilof Islands. When I was the area director,
maybe it was in the 80s.
I'm trying to recall when I was the area director. We had some of the Bureau programs, some of the contracts with the Pribilof Islands. So it probably happened during the 70s, maybe even earlier, when the Bureau then, became more involved in the islands when the sealing I can't remember. You're probably better informed about this time period than I. When they stopped the sealing operations. Remember, there was the big international program about taking seals and that. So when they stopped the sealing operations, that's probably when the Bureau became more active.
Right.
Yeah.
What was it like working for the Bureau? You said before that you were able to travel to all these different villages and connect with people around the state.
Well, when I took over the Bureau in 1980, I came in with the Reagan administration in 1981, and the Bureau still ran the education program. We had 38 day schools.
Wow.
Throughout the state, so I traveled quite a bit we had a lot of employees because we had all these teachers and so forth. Now the Bureau originally, I think, had more day schools, but since statehood, over time, some of the schools were migrating over to the state education regime. And by the time I came aboard, there were 38 left, plus Mount Edgecombe, that came under the Bureau. Then during my watch, we started to transfer all of the day schools, including Mount Edgecombe, over to the state of Alaska. Because we had in mind, I think, both from the federal side and from the state side, that there probably should be a single educational system in the state, and not a separate one like the Bureau ran before. The Bureau, I thought, really did a very good job throughout in their systems, because they had their own teachers. They had good housing for the teachers. They had the schools. And many of the teachers were outside Indians that, were teaching in our villages. A lot of that migrated over to the state when we switched everything over. Then it became quite intense when I became the area director, because we were operating then under a new rule called self-determination, under 638, where we were able to take federal programs that were which were run by federal employees. Now we could contract with the tribal organizations to run those programs. And Alaska was in the forefront in this thing, I have to say, because we spearheaded we were quite aggressive in moving a lot of the government programs into tribal hands. Because I ran Cook Inlet Native Association, so I knew exactly what we could do and patch programs together. Where the federal government, when they're running a program like on social services, they can run only social services. When a tribe runs it, a contract with the Bureau, they can add more money to it from other sources and so forth. Right. So it became a better approach, I thought, with limited funds that were existing at that time. So we were quite aggressive in implementing self-determination in 638. And I think that's why you find the 12 nonprofits right now, regional nonprofits that are running programs, are quite successful.
Going back to your grandpa real quick, did he speak Aleut? Aleut at home with you? Or did he speak both Aleut, English, or Russian?
My grandfather spoke English limitedly.
Okay.
Maybe street English or whatever.
Yeah.
But he spoke Aleut, of course, and spoke Russian.
Wow. What was your grandpa's name? Or how would you spell it? Your grandpa?
What was his name? Lestenkof.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And then your mom, did she speak Aleut or mostly English?
Aleut and English.
Okay.
To my knowledge, I don't think I think my mother could understand Russian, but I don't think she spoke it.
Yeah.
I could, I think maybe at my home they had a rule that they didn't want me to speak Aleut. That was the form that became prevalent, I think, maybe in the islands.
In that generation, yeah.
I was an altar boy in the village, and the Russian priest held Russian classes, during the summertime, and maybe I don't think he was a good teacher, because I don't think any of us really.
You don't think you were a good altar boy?
I don't think any of us really got to the point, and I always regret that, because I think it was probably a great opportunity to learn Russian. During our residing in the islands at that time, but my parents just wanted me to. I could understand Aleut, but I didn't speak it. Did you speak Eskimo?
Only small phrases, exasperations.
Say it like me. Same way. I was just talking to some people upstairs on some programs we're supporting at. Supporting an elderly program here at APIA, but one of the things that they're talking about is language. Language programs are very expensive and very time-consuming. There has to be a personal spark for people to actually want to learn a language.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have that,
you can't force them.
You can't force them, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Wow. I guess, do you have any other stories about either growing up in St. George, or your memories from the war years, or your time in Korea, or your time in the service, the National Guard, or the BIA that you'd like to share?
No.
Okay. We've been here a while, so my last question then is, what words of wisdom or advice do you have for the younger generation today?
I think the opportunity to learn formally, schooling and so forth, occurs only, the opportunity is ripe when you're young and going to years of school, because I see so many people dropping out, and once they're older, then they realize that they need to know more, and it's hard to come back. So I think the opportunity to learn early on is so important and should be taken seriously. This is sometimes where parents come into play. And unfortunately, it seems like in Alaska we're very weak in parental guidance in keeping kids in school. For myself and for others, my contemporaries and whatnot that were in boarding schools, we may have faced that same problem if we remained in our villages and so forth, but being in school, in a boarding school setting, you were pretty much forced to study and learn.
What was your favorite subject in school? One more question and Mount Edgecombe.
Probably history.
Cool.
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.